All the roads are winding.
Welcome to the show, Daniel. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to you today. Thanks for being our guest. And today we also have Shauna on the show as well. So hi, y'all.
It's good to be here. Thanks.
Hello.
So Daniel, we like to begin by setting the energy of the space. Would you like to do that with us for us today?
Sure, I could offer a prayer for the time. I sometimes pray in Yoruba as well, but I'm just going to leave it in English for now. Also, I'm an initiate in West African Orisha tradition, so that's the pause, is kind of feeling into what fits here. I give acknowledgement to my own ancestors of blood and of this land here, traditional Cherokee lands, and I give acknowledgement to the powers that I walk with and that support my life and that support the lives of Natalie and Shauna and the others who may be listening now, and ask that this conversation be held in a spirit of kindness and humility and healing in which it's intended, and ask that you help me to come through clearly, and for everybody listening, for us to just take this moment on earth, this precious moment of being alive here, to reaffirm our commitment to be our best selves and to be loving and wise and to do right by our people and make good use of the opportunity to be alive for just a minute here on earth. Thanks. Shame.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks all the beautiful spirits that we are all walking with. So I'd love to hear, who are your ancestral lineages, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm down lineage from early English and German settler colonialists in North America, and so my ancestors of blood have lived and died on this continent for at least 5, sometimes twice that many generations. And I was born and raised in Ohio, but live now in Western North Carolina as traditional Cherokee or Tsalagi lands. And I'm here with my wife and our 2 daughters. And I'm a U.S. citizen, despite having dreams of being elsewhere. This is where I'm born and playing out a life. So here we are. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Shauna has worked with you and been through many of your courses. And so I'm going to hand it off to her to start the conversation.
Yes, well, it's an honor to have you here. Longtime teacher. Just for the audience to know, Daniel is, a big part of my spiritual journey and very much why I am where I am today. And I think that was like 2010 or 11 when I met you. I don't remember the exact year. I think it was 2011, but regardless, I remember I was in comparative religion class. I was very Christian at this time, which, not shaming anybody who is religious or Christian. I thought I was going to be a pastor. And then I realized not all churches accept women. So that was the thing. And I also had my own spiritual warfare going on in my mind. And I remember my professor, who you're good friends with, Pastor Grant Potts, was like, don't take this class if you don't want to question your belief system and your religion. And I remember being like, nobody's going to shake my love for Jesus Christ. That was a little thought. And it was shaken and it was shook. And you came in and you spoke to the class, and it was one of those epiphanies. And I actually had to leave and cry because I knew my life was going to be so different. Yeah. And I don't want to get emotional now, but
sorry to make you cry and to feel less connected to Jesus.
It was a good cry. It was a good cry because for the first time I had felt seen in what I inherently felt and knew to be true in my body. And so that was really cool. And I thank you for that. And I've been following your teachings ever since. And I hope to one day take your your ancestral practitioner course when the timing is right. And so because I'm very familiar with you and your work and what you have going on, I know that you've been working on a course for a while, and I'm excited. I witnessed you, from social media. So from very distance, go through the process of fatherhood, and you share some really beautiful stories and moments and noticings, and I'm excited to see how that translates into your upcoming course, which is the culture or initiation of life of ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And when you sent out the email, I was like, holy moly, this is like what I've been talking about with my husband, because last year we said that we were going to start trying to conceive for a family a month from now. And now we're like, nah, like that's not happening. It just does not feel like the right time for us. And for a long time, I have been conflicted with ushering in a new life form during times of turmoil. I have conflictions about, I guess, not being where I want to be mentally and spiritually to conceive. And I'd love to get into some conversation around, what does it mean to like usher in new life, like before conception and, after, and the process afterwards. And, there's other different life forms that can be ushered in, other than human. And, I'm very curious about if you can shed any perspectives, around mental illness, epigenetics, and, my husband's totally okay with me being open about this. He is bipolar 1, and does seem to be lineage based. His dad has it, his uncle has it, their grandfather had it. That's as far back as I know his lineage to go, here in the States. So I do know that it seems to be a trend with the males. And so I feel responsibility around that. And I've been doing a lot of research, and there's not even enough like medical science to really understand bipolar as a mental condition, and how it changes and how it has evolved over time. So I've been curious about ancestral practices and rituals to maybe help navigate, whatever spirit that we eventually bring into this life. And we go back and forth if we're even going to have a child, because, it also feels like, is it fair knowing that that's a possibility that they could have, be living with something that is so, it can be very debilitating, if not taken care of properly. So that's what I'm bringing in at the moment. And of course, there's all sorts of traumas and, let's just get into it.
Yeah, I could try to say a few things, Shauna. Thanks for that. And well, for one, I've been teaching in a way that's fairly focused on two things for the last at least 15 years. One is the ancestral healing and reconnection, and the other is earth honoring traditions, what I have come to call animism, a relational value set that recognizes that living humans are just one kind of person, that we're in a much wider field of kinship and relationship, and of course, there are different folks that I'm drawing influence from. One is Graham Harvey, is a British pagan scholar, but he's drawing influence from people like Irving Hollowell, spent time among different Native North American communities. And it's a way of waking up a basic sensibility that is present in all of our lineages, that humans aren't the center of the universe, and we have relational accountability to the rest of life. And those are basic good values. There's nothing appropriative about saying, I want to move in good relationship with the earth and the rest of life. And so I've been teaching for years about the animist ethics in some form or another, land-based ritual, relating with the other than humans. And then also included in that is relating with our human ancestors, with the larger web of kinship and relationship that we're connected to through blood and other ways too. And then in addition to those two, the third leg of the tripod, at least through Ancestral Medicine, this organization I founded and guide, is ritual arts. because we can be great with the ancestors, we can be great with the earth, and not necessarily be a ritualist and not be focused on that per se. A lot of the fundamentals of being good with the ancestors and the earth are not wedded to any particular form in which it's expressed. It can look so many different ways. But a lot of folks are also drawn to ritual as a kind of, I see it as an art, like a creative expression in a lot of ways. It's also very pragmatic because it can refer to a whole body of different practices or sensibilities that facilitate communication between the humans and the other than humans. In that way, ritual tech can be very simple or very elaborate. And so the third thing that I'm teaching to, as you mentioned, over the years, but also making more explicit now, is ritual arts. And so the course that's coming up this spring, Northern Spring, is called Initiations: A Life of Ritual. And in that, the premise, which I'm excited about, is drawing on my background as a doctor of psychology and a therapist, and someone who actually respects psychology and thinks a lot of spiritual folks could do with some good therapy, and vice versa. A lot of therapists could stand to do some ritual. It's on and on, but the premise of the course is basically that if we look at the human lifespan from conception until becoming an ancestor after death, so pre-birth to post-death, there are periods where it is really important to bring certain skills to bear or to learn certain proficiencies. And a lot of those get expressed in ritual sensibilities. That can include learning how to call out for help. It's in the course, the thing I placed right at birth. The first ritual skill is invocation, crying, which is a kind of invocation of help. And that invocation is needed when you're 80 as well. It's not just in one moment. And so what I'm excited about with that course is to link the learning of ritual fundamentals to different stages of life. So it's possible to learn ritual skills alongside a sensibility that recognizes we go through different phases of life. There are different challenges at different phases. Ritual and the navigation of all that's implied in that doesn't come all at once. And our approach to the sacred is going to change over the course of a life. What we need to be focusing on is going to change. So I'm excited to approach learning ritual fundamentals in that cyclic, more organic way. And that includes the possibility in midlife, usually but it can happen in different ways. There's no normative or correct life. Looking at the possibility of having children or creations, generativity, and what is it to actually make meaning and manifest and give back in the world. Children and parenting being one of many ways to explore that. And it's been hugely transformative in my own life, as we have a 1 and a 4-year-old girls here, and they're awesome and totally demanding, as kids are. And it's helped me to see, to understand something about the mystery of the ancestors from a different perspective, from the perspective of their returning. And, I knew it intellectually before, but it's a different thing to be a father and to see that each returning soul they're not a child soul. It's like a full adult soul coming into a child body, and all of the awkwardness of that. And they come with their own destiny. They come with their own temperament and challenges, all of that. So as basic as that is, that's a starting point for a discussion about ritual or the sacred and parenting, is to recognize that each returning soul really has different needs. There's no one script for how to be a spiritual parent. It requires adapting your own particular gifts to the gifts and needs of the child, and finding the alchemy of what's going to work with that. It also means knowing how to call on your own support and backing so that the helpful powers can nurture through you the children. And we tend to get conditioned to experience ourselves as kind of alone in the world. And, capitalism and the messed up structures and the super nuclear family and all that tends toward parents being quite isolated. It's definitely been the case with the pandemic. Damn, it's hard sometimes. And we're pretty resourced and privileged. But 2 years of bringing a baby into the world and parenting young kids is a lot. And it's been helpful to know that even though we haven't had a lot of human support necessarily, the spirits, the powers are backing us, and to feel them in the moment, supporting with the care for the youngers. Parents need nurtured as well. Yeah, those are a few things to start with. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And there's so many different ways I'm like, I want to go everywhere. I love what you were saying. And so just a little background for the audience that may not know me. I'm a co-founder here at Earthspeak with Natalie, and I am currently working on finishing an undergrad in psychological ethnic anthropology. I'm very interested in continuing on, hopefully getting my master's in mental health counseling. I'm mixed race. I have multiple lineages of enslaved African ancestors, and there's a lot that can be said around that. And I also come from Silesian Germanic people. And this war that is on the precipice has been hitting home. And so I've been doing, work with my ancestors who have gone through similar turmoil in those same lands or near it. And I am, my work is focused on dismantling systems of oppression. And as somebody who is mixed race, I see a lot of things. I carry multiple perspectives, and I'm focused in my life's work, and my purpose is to bring about change. And I love the idea of children being a part of that change. And I also like what you had started to say about, bodies of work can also be considered new life form, like something that you're birthing. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of children, when I'm like on the fence of like, are we going to have kids? Are we not going to have kids? It's like, how do we bring them into the world and nurture them through, all the different systematic conditionings. And my mind is spinning. I'm like, where do I even exactly want to go with this? But you had said, kids being returning ancestors. And I think that's really cool, because for a long time, I have felt that in myself. And I don't know, it was just like this one day I just woke up and it was like, this is your work. And so I've been on this like automatic pilot to get to that point. And I think children are so potent and powerful, and the way that we bring them into this world is equally as potent and powerful, and the ideologies that we teach them. And, I think I'm going to stop there for now and see what's coming up for you.
Yeah, there's so much, really. I think if folks wanted to approach from before conception the potential journey into parenting in a maximally conscious way, in addition to all the good psychological growth work to be an integrated, whole, loving person, which all matters and is important and is ongoing and is never going to be perfect, but one can be committed and for the long haul of being a conscious person. In addition to that, and of being a culturally conscious person, I think it's good to do the cleanup with your ancestral lineages, meaning helping any among your recent ancestors and older ones for that matter, who are not yet at peace, to be at peace. So they're backing you. And it's good in general. It's also the case that the children are the ancestors returning. And so if there's disturbance in the ancestral field, does it increase the odds a bit that the soul or spirit of the one returning could come back with some of that disturbance? I think it does. I'm hesitant to say that just because I would never wish to suggest that any challenges that a child brings or a parent has in the birthing and of a child is somehow their fault. I don't think that's a helpful view. And it's possible to do things to reduce risk, I guess, and to increase the odds of a favorable things going in a favorable way. And I also don't have the story that folks ought to have children. I guess I said that before, but that's something between us and our own destiny and ancestors, and they come with their own trajectory. Like, it's, in a way, I almost want to say, of course this isn't true, but like, there's not a category of child exactly. They're just like small humans. And there's something about the category of child that can suggest, of course, historically it's been like that they're not a full person, or that they're not their own whole being. And of course, they're dependent and potentially annoying and demanding and all kinds of things that kids are. But there's a way in which they really are going to have their own, like, I'm kind of just here to help them get acquainted a bit. It's a bit more involved than that, but there is a way in which I'm looking to a degree to them on like a soul level to see, like, what do they need? What do they, what can I offer them that's actually going to fit well for what they need on a soul level? And yeah, it's been a delight, for example, with our older daughter, Maeve, to see how animist values of recognizing the personhood of not just the animals and plants, but she's like, is a car a person? Is a tire a person? Is this crumb a person? And we'll talk about it. And she's very clever, and we'll I was cleaning out some ritual items, and so we released some woodpecker feathers that I had to the earth. And as soon as we did that, a pileated woodpecker like flew by and landed on the tree. And I was like, oh, there you go. Look, there's a response. I'm trying to act not surprised. And she's like, she's not surprised either. She's like, yeah, of course. I mean, what do you expect, Daddy? Like, we just put woodpecker feathers out, and that's really normal. And it's not naive. It's actually a recognition of the interconnectedness of things. So I don't know that children are inherently wise. They're selfish little pains in the ass sometimes too, but they also have this very open channel, instinctive ability to know things. And that is something we can nurture along, especially if we've cultivated it in ourselves. And that it's very subversive to do that. And so parents who are bringing the explicit conscious values to their parenting in that way can very much interrupt the colonialism. It's kind of like the dust that we're often breathing.
So I know that part of the course, and it's a year long, so, I don't expect you to unpack this all here in this space and time with us, but I know that part of it is, it aims to empower and just kind of transform cultural norms that block the ability to build the capacity to change, to regulate, all kinds of stuff. Natalie's very much into, nervous healing or nervous system and regulation and all of that. And I'm curious, a question that's coming up for me is, can you speak a little bit about that? And I'm also curious about the intersection between how does this look with other than human forms too. And a story that like just super quick is I recently went out of town for a funeral, and I was with my sister, who I have a lot of siblings. She's 6 years old, and she was crying one night just at the table, and she put her head down, and I thought she was tired. So I'm like, go to bed. If you're sleepy, go to bed. Like, you're not going to miss anything. I'm right behind you. Go to bed. And she started crying, and I tried to talk to her to like see where she was feeling it in her body, like what's going on. And she eventually came back out, and she started giving everybody a hug to go to sleep. And she comes to me, and she was like, well, I know why I was crying, and it's not because I was tired. And I was like, oh, well, tell me more. Why are you crying? And she was like, well, I was crying because it hit me that you're leaving tomorrow and I'm going to miss you. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I had to try not to cry at that point. And so, I talked to her about that, but it was in that moment that I'm like, wow, like, she was so smart, and to be able to bring that awareness up for herself, and communicate it so clearly. And I think it's so important that, we are building the capacity to be able to feel things in our body and communicate what's coming up. And in my family, like I just kind of explained, like, feelings are kind of oppressed in some ways.
Oh, yeah. I mean, geez, most of the adults I know are operating at a relatively young developmental stage in terms of being able to just identify what they're feeling, make space for that, and communicate about it in a coherent, not wildly selfish or reactive way. And so just on a basic psychological level, like, a lot of people are hurting and in a kind of stuck condition. I don't mean that in a judgmental way. It just means that we don't often get the skills from our family of origin that we need to navigate adult complexity and nuance. And so we need to seek them out later, which is fine. It just takes some effort and willingness to be with some discomfort to learn some new skills. It's not that different with learning with respect to ritual or reclaiming animist values or relating with the ancestors. I'm a teacher in terms of my like archetypal energy. I enjoy teaching, and so I take an interest in what actually works. Like, what's good pedagogy? How do you learn to come back into relationship with the ancestors, with life, etc.? And I have a soft spot actually for the intellectuals who need the framework for it. Because some people are like, give me the practices, I'll do it, and then I'm in relationship, and then I'm good. Like, so great. If that's good, do it that way. You don't need all the intellectual framework necessarily. You really don't. But a lot of folks are from a place of fear or control, or just because they like to understand things. They need it intellectually to make sense, and to not just be random, superstitious, making stuff up that you're talking to trees or talking to dead people. Okay, so how do you transition from a reductionist materialist epistemology or way of processing knowledge into a more animist, decolonized, perhaps you can say indigenous if you mean it in a broad sense, epistemology that recognizes there are lots of different ways to know a thing, and that includes intuition, it includes dreaming, it includes direct sort of sensory, like body level knowing, and that's not less legitimate. It actually is more effective to expand what is legitimate knowledge. And furthermore, we tend to construct persons, like a legitimate legal and relational person, as other living humans, and not even all of them. And because we tend to see certain groups of other people, even like progressive minded leftists who don't think they do it, will tend to see certain other groups of people as less than fully human. Typically the people who don't agree with their certain values. Like, okay, that's really mature. And, but nonetheless, we do it. And when we do that, we preemptively shut ourselves off to relationship, intimacy, and interaction with the others, with the other than humans, the stones, the trees, the deities, the spirits, the ancestors, whatever, or with our neighbors, whatever it might be. So how do we interrupt that? Well, one of the ways is to start to chip at the underlying assumptions of this really reductionist worldview that a lot of us are indoctrinated into unconsciously. For example, the idea that there is such a thing as nature is a toxic view. It is used to contrast with humans. So there's humans and nature. We need to save the environment. It's a terribly false binary or dichotomy. And as opposed to saying there are many other kinds of people and they have their other neighborhoods and whatever, it makes sense to recognize that there are spaces that are not human shaped. And then there are other spaces like urban areas that are more human shaped. But even so, this idea that we're fundamentally apart from others, it's a residue that comes from this legacy of human supremacy, this idea that we're above the other kinds of people. So we could talk about the cultural troubles as different forms of supremacy. Sure, there's white supremacy or ancestral arrogance and superiority that gets institutionalized in all kinds of fatal and terrible ways, or male supremacy or cisgendered supremacy or like nationalism and all that. And another that needs included is human supremacy. And it would please my heart to see more really committed, well-meaning folks working for different kinds of political and social change also include that in their sensibilities. And to see that the idea that culture is a human thing only is a manifestation of this kind of arrogance. The sparrows and the rivers and the mosses have their own culture, their own ways of doing communication and family and community and consciousness and all that. And if we think we're above that, well, we got issues and we're off-putting to the rest of life. And so those attitudes that we've often unconsciously internalized, that there are only certain kinds of people, there are only certain legitimate ways of knowing, culture is a distinctly human thing. For example, those assumptions lead to bad outcomes. If that's what you're cooking up culture with, in the kitchen of culture, you're going to cook up like nasty tasting culture. It does not work well. And so if we can understand the inputs, then what is created can be a bit more life affirming and nourishing and beautiful. And that can show up in how we parent or how we do whatever we do with our time. Because we can't transmit something to the kids or, and usually it's non-verbally. We can't embody or model something for the kids that we haven't really taken to heart ourselves.
I would love to hear you paint a picture of what life might look like or could look like if en masse people were to adopt, were to shed human supremacy and adopt more of this inherent interconnectedness as just a worldview. How might our lives look different and feel different? What is that world?
That's good. It's good to try on that question. Well, the world would feel safer and kinder, for one. And we would be more generous to people who are different than us. And we would collectively recognize that we have a few centuries of cleanup to do, because we are going to continue to, for the foreseeable future, even if somebody, everybody goes to sleep tonight and wakes up from some massive dream where they have a big spiritual opening all at once, we still are on a trajectory to continue making more humans, which use resources. And I'm not suggesting people shouldn't have kids, and yet we need to address population in a not racist, conscientious way. And so we still have that challenge of how to feed people without wiping out our other than human communities. And we still have the systems we've created, which are often really hazardous and have a lot of the different kinds of hazardous supremacies baked into them. And so there's a need to overhaul the systems. And really quick change is rarely easy to stabilize. It doesn't work that well usually. And so there would be a need to diligently move as quickly as possible without burning the house down in the process to overhaul the systems to become more just and more reflective of human diversity, and to proactively work at the generational repairs that are needed. And those are different in different areas. In the United States, where we're sitting, there's a need to face the double genocides upon which this particular nation was founded, and to express that especially through active repairs with Indigenous folks and African ancestor, African American and Black people here, and to actually physically make tangible repairs and have the system stop creating new harm. So there's plenty of work to be done, right? And yeah, but the world would be kinder. That's the short version of it. And we would recognize that we have a deep responsibility to one another, and that war anywhere is war everywhere. There's a need to, there's some balance, I think, between having a real international global sensibility, but also being very locally rooted. And I think there would be a increased valuing of folks who are rooting in locally to really learn and love the land where they're at. And you're not going to legally and politically become Indigenous people, because that's a different topic, but it's possible to bring the sensibilities of deep love and reverence for the land where you're at into embodiment. And from that place to move as an ally to folks who've been there longer than you. Because we have, and not just in the United States, but Canada and South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Israel. There's a lot of places on Earth where there are rough legacies of settler colonialism, Tibet, and when that's happened, it's a complicated disentangling to know how to move forward. But it involves centering the voices of people who have been harmed and displaced and marginalized through that colonialism.
Thank you. The sassy, sarcastic person in me is like, wait, we can't solve it with just a meme on Instagram?
Right. Yeah. People would get really excited about their Facebook and post all kinds of happy memes, and it would be game over because we're all enlightened. End of interview.
Done. Yeah, thanks for painting that picture. And
yeah, I would add one thing, that the people here in this country, and it applies in other places, but I'll speak to what I can speak to. The people who haven't been already doing this would need to get real good at grieving, and to just feel the sorrow of what we've invoked on ourselves over the last few centuries here, and how deep the mess is, and how deep the trauma is, and that spirit of like, I'm so sorry we did it this way. Like, I know we need to make repairs, but give me just a moment to be in the experience of I'm so sorry. So there'd be more of that. So people who haven't yet felt it would come in through the gateway of sorrow, and from there start to figure out how to make repairs. Because when you rush to make repairs without feeling a thing, there are worse things to do than try really hard to do the right thing. That's commendable. But there's a need to slow down enough to feel it, or you're at risk of moving like quickly and recklessly through it as a way of avoiding the pain. Doesn't mean our life has to be defined by pain, but there's a need to feel the mess and recognize, oh, wow, this isn't gonna get resolved by me individually or in my lifetime. Okay, recalibrating. What now?
Mm-hmm. So something you mentioned there really kind of like struck a chord in me, and I want to just hear your perspective on this a little more, of talking about population, the need to kind of control our population. And in the past, this is a hot topic. So I'd love to just hear a little more about what you mean by that. What's your perspective?
I remember being in university years ago and doing environmental activism, and found myself wanting to walk the most direct path between two buildings, not to get to class, but to use the least amount of calories, so I would have the least environmental impact. And it led me basically to a conclusion. It's a way of thinking. It's like, if I was courageous, I would kill myself, and that would be my service to the earth. And I'm like, well, this approach isn't working out. I need to come at this in a different way. And yet there's I don't know if it's right to say there's too many humans, but there's too many humans already for us to enjoy the privileges and the comforts and the kinds of food and access to resources that a lot of people appropriately want if they don't already enjoy. And yet any suggestion that we should intentionally, like by policy, control population super understandably brings up fear, and a warranted fear of supremacist attitudes, the like forced sterilization, imposed like racist, harmful views, or subtly racist views that somehow population is a problem in developing countries where they have more kids, so-called developing countries. All that can get very toxic, right? Because folks in the United States, for example, resource-wise, if 2 kids here is probably 10 kids somewhere else, because of how much stuff people use ecologically. And what I believe about that is that if we internationally work in respectful ways to empower women and provide women around the world with access to resources, education, access to family planning, access to choices, and access to legal, safe abortion, and access to whatever people need to navigate their lives, and to know that there are options. The people will make the choices that they need to make. But if you want to look at one of the single best things you can do for environmental change, or for the shifting the ecological catastrophe on Earth, is to be a really fierce feminist and seek to have women around the world have access to all kinds of education, resources, and choices. It leads to better outcomes. Yeah.
That's literally in the IPCC too. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know what that is, I don't remember what it stands for, but I had to read it for my master's thesis, and it's basically talking about, climate, what's happening with climate change, and what are our best approaches to solving it. And one of the top things they mention is giving access to resources to women around the world and giving them education. It's like huge. So thanks for illuminating that a little more, just kind of unpacking that. And I'm going to kind of hand it back to Shauna. Thanks.
Yeah, that actually fed really nicely into what was coming up for me when you were speaking, about how to begin to change the system. And in all the studying that I've been doing, it leads back to change in capacity and resources. And I'm curious of what you have to say around, not everyone has the same access to education. It's, part of disparity. And of course, I'm coming from this conversation as somebody who lives in, the United States. And my entire worldview is always shifting. Every class I take, my worldview expands. And I'm grateful to be able to take these classes. And one thing that you had said around the earth is this came about in soil science. Like, I did not know, like, I knew inherently that soil is important. We need to have plants, but I didn't realize how important soil is and how symbiotic everything is. And yeah, and even in terms of like changing, dismantling racism, that comes from a need to understand the historical context and how it transformed via social context and how it's embedded and the ways that we each carry that with us and, reflect that out through our everyday actions. And, but not everyone has access to education. So I'm curious what you have to say around that, and what ways can ritual help there?
Yeah. What to say? There are lots of different kinds of education, of course, and like some of the traditionalists that I've spent time with in Nigeria, for example, they don't, some of them have, but a lot of them haven't necessarily done like university training or formal education in that way, but they could recite for hours different verses and songs and ritual and like carry out multiple day elaborate ritual processes. And there was a moment where I was sitting on a bench in, maybe it was like 5 a.m. It was pre-sunrise in Nigeria one time. It's hard wooden bench that you sit on in ritual. And the men were in the kind of in the back room feeding ritually a odu, which is one of the seen as a more primordial or like hazardous by virtue of being very potent deities, like a very primordial female creational deity, I guess. And there was somebody sitting next to me, and I saw it intuitively in a clear way. For one, I was like, oh, isn't it nice to be up at 5 a.m. with the guys feeding the ancient mothers that hold up life? What a nice way to spend time. And then I saw also my own arrogance, that I had been conditioned to view like some of the folks that were there were like, I think they worked as farmers, or they're very working class people, which even by like Yoruba standards is especially working class from like a US perspective. Like folks who don't have a lot of, they may or may not have a bank account. Like they don't have a lot of money, right? They don't have a lot of resources. They don't, they're not going to be able to respond to a Facebook post about intersectionality in a way that doesn't get them canceled or whatever. Like they're not, like they don't have that thing going on. And yet some part of me had been conditioned to like look down on them. And it wasn't about race in that moment. Of course, it could intersect that. And I'm like the white guy on the bench, but it was really about the arrogance of having a PhD and to be conditioned into a certain view of education that says that I'm more educated than them. Like if it was like a grow food competition, I would be like begging them for some yam at the end of it. Like, I can't feed myself. Sorry. And so, for example, not just that. And I felt sad. And it was a good kind of sadness, like a melting away of like, oh, I'm sorry that I brought my arrogance across the ocean here. Well, I was showing up fine. Nobody like thought I was being arrogant, but I could see it. It's like this little like constriction in my heart. And I felt ashamed of it. It's appropriate, really, to feel it. It's just like falling away. And that's an American thing sometimes. It's like nationalism, American exceptionalism, all that garbage, really, that floats around and people internalize. But depends where we place our value on what we construct as educated. There are some folks who have real different views than me that are like Republicans, let's say. And I don't think it's going out on a limb on your show to say I'm not a Republican, but some of them are nicer people than some of the mean-spirited, puritanical, radical leftists who are busy tearing each other apart. And so who's really educated there? And I guess what I'm saying is I've come to value kindness and good relational ethics quite a lot in how I construct education. And I think that folks who have a lot of formal intellectual education but have not yet been educated in how to be kind can still learn that. Those are also things that can be learned. Yeah.
Something you said reminded me of a conversation that Natalie and I recently just had. And we were talking about how displaced we feel and from our roots. And we were talking about living on the land and like feeling feeling guilty for wanting to embody Native American indigenous ways that we weren't raised within, and and feeling like if we are able to know who our ancestors are, not everybody has that privilege, we might be able to uncover some of those traditions, but for me at least, I don't feel like it would be the same. And so we were having those conversations around, so we're displaced from our lineage, our traditions, and access to education is different. And so there's all these things that just kind of play with each other, and it's so paradoxical. And it's like, how do we be with the land? And for me, and I mean, I have to say this because it's a part of like my journey, is the Foundations of Ritual course that you offer help shift a lot of things for me, because like, well, we can start to create our own, and we can build relationship with the spirits of the land we're on. But I'd love to hear you, see if anything comes up for you around that.
There's so much about belonging, and I've watched it in the international folks that I teach. I've seen Black African folks totally miss African American folks. And I've seen Europeans be like, why are you white Americans or Australians like so neurotic about your sense of belonging? I don't get it. Like, what's going on over there? And so when people are forcibly taken from their homes, or when there is a choice to leave, either under duress or voluntarily, unless there's a lot of care given to that change, and even if there is, it's an impactful change to move from where your people have been in the earth for a long time, especially if there's not really a choice. And so statistically, the vast majority of humans living in North America are not of lineages that lived here before colonization and enslavement of people. And so it means that there's a lot of pain to sort through, and belonging isn't very straightforward. And part of how I think we work at belonging is we get to know our own ancestors of blood and bring them into the conversation and make sure we're not being haunted or ghosted by our people, and then bring them into relationship with the land where we're at, into conversation with the land where we're at, and into those elder powers who are the mountains and soils and trees and rivers and woodpeckers where we're at, and at least say hello. Be like, hey, it's me. I'm complicated. I'm kind of neurotic. I'm not sure where I fit, but I'm here. Hello today. I'm here. And so rather than waiting for some perfect scenario where we get to belong and we're raised in this tribal culture and it's all like, easeful, if that ever happened on Earth. I'm not sure if it did, because we're not going to have that perfect scenario. We have to find our awakening. We have to find our well-being, our wisdom, our kindness in the specific circumstances of our lives as they are right now. Because if we are looking for something else, we'll never get there. So it means, I think, though, accepting that our ancestors often created, now I'm speaking to folks who are of settler colonialist lineages or lineages that have done a lot of harm, created a mess that we've inherited. So we inherit this ledger of ancestral debts, as well as blessings, both. And part of being a grown-up is saying, well, I accept these debts. It's not like I didn't do it personally. It's like, well, my people did it. And if I want to stand with them, then I need to say we did it. And if I'm their face, then functionally I did it. Therefore what? How does that look now? How do I participate in accordance with my destiny and what I'm able to do in some kind of repair? Because I'll sleep better, I'll be more useful and less annoying as a person. And I'll also, I'll feel a little bit more at home if I do it like that. And there's 1,000 different ways it can look, none of which require feeling guilty or ashamed of yourself. Because that just tends to, if you just cave in, you're like, I'm a loser, I'm so white, or I'm so whatever, you're not actually being very useful. It's still white centering. It's still from a place of ego. It's like, great, have some feelings. Sorry, you're having a cultural shame attack. Get up when you're ready, and we have some work to do. So then there's still a need to like participate in the fix. Yeah.
I almost wish we could like go have a time travel machine and go back and like be immersed in that way in order to sort of like how at that moment in the ritual you recognized your arrogance. How can we recognize what we're so in that we're blind to or can't see in ourselves because it's just part of the lens that we see through? So I just really appreciate your answer. And yeah, if you have any reflections.
Yeah, all I would add there is something I've seen again and again, whether it's sitting in circle with Native folks on this continent, mostly Lakota altar, a little bit Native American church, or with folks in Nigeria, or wherever, like sitting in circle with traditionalists, people who are more kind of raised with the thing. A common quality is being very pragmatic. Like you're not stressing out if they're using a plastic bucket to bring in the water for the sweat lodge rather than a skin and all that, or some like special pouch, or if you have to improvise and people are doing a divination in Nigeria, they pick up their cell phone and have a little argument and then hang up the cell phone and then go back to reciting the verse. And the Americans, white or black, are like kind of like mortified, like, oh my goodness, like why is this person being so unspiritual? And they're just like, whatever. It's seamless. It's integrated with life. It's not. There's not the brittle purist kind of energy or the fragility there. And so that pragmatic spirit, it means being willing to just touch the earth where you're at, the complicated earth that maybe has also been the receptacle for poison and harm. And maybe you're in an urban area. Maybe you're like behind a mall next to a dumpster, or like there's some like the least spiritual space you could imagine. And to touch the earth there and be like, I've forgotten some things. Can you help me to remember? I feel a little bit locked out of my own house. It's sad to forget how to navigate life. I could use some help remembering. You'll get a response. And it's more interesting than trying to manufacture the perfect conditions. And because the part of the response in some ways will be like, oh yeah, shit's kind of lit, huh? Like, welcome back. Like, or like, yeah. is kind of like, it's hard on the earth too. Like, it's complicated. And it's not like, how to say, we want welcome. Sometimes in our journey developmentally, we want to be the child, and that's okay. It's a good place to start. We want to be welcomed back by like the grandmas and the elder powers that are like, just take care of me. I feel like an orphan. I broke my culture. What do I do? And they're like, oh, just, you look ragged. Come on in. We can give you some soup. And then once you're not in a child consciousness only, you also are able to hold some adult consciousness. Then it's that moment where your parents or your grandparents start sharing their own pain with you. Like, oh, you want to hear some stuff? Yeah, I didn't tell you because you were too young. Let me tell you about this, that, and another thing. And then you're like, oh, I never knew. Well, yeah, I didn't tell you. So the earth in that way, and the powers, stop looking like the idealized earth that we imagined, the indigenous people that we're not communing with. And it looks like the earth that we know that's hurting. It's like, yeah, welcome back. Your pain, my pain, they're not so different, you know? Oh, that's what belonging is? Oh, geez. Am I sure I still want it? Well, go back. Try not belonging again. You'll come back. So,
Anywhere you go, there's going to be pain. How do you deal with it?
yeah.
There's part of me that wants to ask about, we're talking about this as two white people and one mixed race, white assuming person, none of us who are indigenous. And how might we not be, we're talking about these kind of indigenous perspectives and without including an indigenous person in the conversation. So is there any sort of acknowledgement or thing to speak to there around that?
Yeah, so I want to be clear that even though I've been influenced personally by indigenous teachings at times, a lot of my influences are not from groups that are considered legally and politically indigenous. Indigenous as a meaningful term is something from the last century, and it has an important function. And it's not that those dynamics of colonialism weren't playing out before the last century, because of course they were, but indigeneity legally and politically is inseparable from colonialism, and it doesn't have the same utility in all places. Like in Africa, Yoruba people are not legally and politically indigenous, but I just like would pay to watch white people explain to Yoruba people how they're not indigenous, and because they're the folks that have been living where they're living for a long time. And so if I'm drawing on like Yoruba perspectives that activate within me a sense of ancestral knowing about some of the pre-Roman, Germanic, and Celtic, British perspectives that I'm down lineage from, what I would say at a certain point is possible to say, these are earth-honoring values. I don't presume to speak for indigenous peoples, but I can speak from what it's been like for me to wrestle with being down lineage from colonialism and settler colonialism, and the impact that's had on my dedication to reclaiming earth-honoring values and cultural self-esteem, frankly. Because seeing myself as less than indigenous people in any way is hazardous to them, because it leaves them in a state of idealization from me, which lets me off the hook and objectifies them. And so it's a kind of subtle racism that's like, oh, you get to be the spiritual indigenous people. I'll be the like bad white guy. It's lazy, because it lets me off the hook from having to become a cultivated adult who can hold my own and be right with my ancestors in the earth. So I don't need permission from indigenous folks to love the earth, so to speak. I mean, it's awkward to ask for that. I happen to live in a place where there's a rough history of occupation of land, and not a straightforward path to emigrate back to London and be like, what's up, London? I'm back. And they're like, okay, can you afford it? I'm like, I don't know. We didn't think that far ahead. And so we're in a mess, and there's not a lot of sudden moves to be made. But I want to be clear in what I'm teaching and where I'm coming from in the conversation, that it's not my intent to represent Indigenous perspectives in a generalized way. It's more animist, earth-honoring values. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
It's not so much of a question, but rather a theme that I am sensing arising both within this conversation, in my studies, within society, is this need to claim. And I'm finding that part of what part of what makes it difficult to shift away from the idea of racial categories within my family, and this is based off of conversations I've had with my family and my own knowing and speaking with other people, is I think there's this fear of like, okay, if we don't have racial categories, then what am I? Who am I? And as Americans, North Americans in the United States who already feel very displaced, I think there is a genuine fear there around like claiming things.
I think it's important to honor our ancestral position and roots, and that there's also a place for being able to say, I'm a white person personally, and there are certain, complexities and things I need to look out for, and privileges, and there are implications to that. And so we don't, the trick is how much to frame things in terms of really deeply problematic and baseless categories of race, which have nonetheless become really impactful and important to recognize. So how do we give attention to that as much as is needed without unnecessarily replicating it? One of the strategies that I find helpful when possible is to be a notch more specific. To say that I'm of English and German descent, it's more meaningful than saying like, hey, I'm a white guy. It's like this, okay, well, that's also true. I can joke about that. And also it's deadly serious at times too. So I'm not contesting that, but I'm not interested in claiming whiteness as some kind of meaningful identity. Whiteness is a kind of amnesia that eliminated the cultural diversity of Europe in a terrible agreement to colonize the Americas. And so I can understand why, as an outsider, why people might have more interest in claiming Blackness or native sort of pan-indigenous identities, and not necessarily feel a need to say like, oh, well, I'm partly Ghanaian or from here. I don't know my ancestry because of enslavement, or I'm this tribal nation, that tribal nation. That's not my place to say how people ought to navigate that. But in terms of whiteness, it's a bankrupt identity. It needs recognized, because white supremacy is still really baked into a lot of things, a lot of attitudes, a lot of systems, and all that. But I have no interest in wearing that as a source of pride. For me, that has to do with my own European ancestors who are anti-racist or abolitionist or, opposed, like anti-war or whatever it might be. There's always been conscious, solidarity-oriented white people who are working against oppression. It just hasn't been enough still.
Thank you for speaking to that. And I think that what we need to move towards doesn't yet exist. A lot of what we're navigating is new.
Part of what comes to mind, sorry to jump in, Shauna, just feels very present to express, and maybe it's the sort of last thing I want to make sure to convey, is that if we try to come up with all the cultural solutions without including the people we've been excluding, we're going to get more of the same. We're going to get just more intellectual rearranging of all the identities and all that. And then people who are doing like culture version 2.38 will be terrible to people doing culture version 2.37. And then it's just this like constant struggle to be right and to participate in the latest, version of righteousness. Nothing about that is like feeds life. And so to get the solutions, so to speak, to the mess we've made, I think it's important to include not only the too often marginalized voices of people of different backgrounds that need included, but also the other than human people. Also how do we actually bring the land, the rivers, the human dead, the mosses, all the creatures and all the deities and the ones whose bodies are so-called nature, bring them into the actual dialogue. They're certainly not welcome in universities. What's up with that? So universities are busy replicating human supremacy and the intellectual arrogance that would exclude the other than humans, because mostly there's not a willingness to look at the underlying epistemology that says only thoughts of other living humans are real. I'm like, well, that's a pretty limited data set, said the rest of life. And so the others need included. Any solution making beyond that move is skipping steps. So then the priority is like, how do we actually include them? Well, I forgot how to talk to them. So either A, they don't exist because I don't know how to talk to them. That's like saying only people who speak English exist. What an insane view. Or maybe I need to relearn how to communicate. Aha. Humbling, but nonetheless a more fruitful approach. So, I mean, not to be so cocky about it, but that's what I have. That's what keeps me teaching ritual basics with my life, is because I feel like until we're able to bring the others into the conversations, whether it's the insular, sometimes useful, sometimes righteous conversations on the American left about how to frame everything, or really big global international conversations about how to respond to war, or really serious, important conversations that need a lot of focus and whatever the flavor of it is, or like an argument between a couple at home. Until we can bring the other than humans in on that and invite their guidance and wisdom, we're still operating moment to moment from a set of assumptions that basically says we're alone, because if we dig deeper, we're kind of better than others. Well, we need to revisit that. That's not getting very good results. Yeah, so that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that is like the best place to wrap this conversation up, and liberating otherness is what that's what I've dedicated the rest of my life to. And thank you so much. We'll go ahead and wrap up. Is there anything else that you would like for people to take away? And I'd love for you to share what you offer. How can people connect with you? What do you have coming up?
Yeah, I feel like I've said most of what I might want to. I always like to temper it by saying, like, don't let all that be discouraging. I know sometimes I can have an intense edge, but mostly coming back into relationship with your ancestors, the earth, and all that, if you're not already doing that, is actually really normal and really accessible and doable. So don't feel like it's so daunting. And I'm the founder and director at Ancestral Medicine. So our site is ancestralmedicine.org, and we have a lot of different online classes on ancestral healing. And the next one's coming up this spring is a practical animism course, where we dive a lot into this terrain we've been navigating about how to reclaim relationships with the others. And then the new course that I mentioned, Initiations: A Life of Ritual, which is our first year-long, more immersive kind of journey together, real like community building as well. And so those will be open for registration. And then if folks are drawn to the ancestral healing practices, the only other thing I'd mention is that there's a directory of practitioners from around the world. The work is offered, I believe, in 9 languages as of now, and that's growing. And we have options for low-income sessions. So if you like what I'm up to, but you don't like me in particular, there's a way around that. Just work with one of the practitioners, and there's a way to have direct personal support for reconnection with your own ancestors from folks of lots of different backgrounds and language abilities. So yeah, it's encouraging. So I'm appreciative of our team at Ancestral Medicine, and thank you both for the time today. I hope people are well met by the conversation.
Thank you, Daniel, so much.
Yes, thank you. It's been a real treat.
Mm-hmm.
All the roads are windy.
Listen to over 200 free EarthSpeak podcast episodes on your favorite podcast app, and visit earthspeak.love to learn about our collective community and workshops.